Okay, well, welcome everyone. I think we all know Sondra, and we're looking forward very much, Sondra, to what you have to say to us tonight. Like I said previously, love when you give a report on the communities. It helps us feel as if we're really partners with you. So I'll open up over to you, and enjoy, everybody.
Okay. Well, a good morning or good evening, everybody. And thank you for joining us today for our monthly Israel update. And yes, I love doing this. The last month, I remember I had just landed from the States and I kind of slid into it, but this one I knew I was doing this. So, I'm more prepared this time. Anyway, so I have a lot of things to talk about today. First of all, I want to bring you up to date on the two biggest issues that have been in the news in Israel. One is already a story that's been developing for quite some time, and it is disturbing. And that is, it seems, or at least this is the suspicion, that, let me backtrack a little bit. There's a company called NSO, and it's a high-tech company in Israel that develops very advanced software, doing all kinds of fancy things. And a number of months ago, the United States was a bit annoyed with this company because it seemed to have been selling spyware kind of technology, not necessarily to people that should be having that capability. And that's a story that kind of was in the news for a few days, and then it disappeared, and none of us really knew what happened with it. And we figured, okay, whatever, it's gone. Well, now the story has come back with a vengeance. It seems that this company, the software that we are referring to, is a software called Pegasus, and it's a software that enables people to get into someone's cell phone and not only, let's say, listen to phones or, like do wiretapping kind of stuff, but to literally pull in all of the stuff that's on someone's cell phone. It could be previous text messages, it could be emails, it could be photos, it could be documents, anything that you have on your phone. Okay, well, this is a technology that I would say most of us in Israel, at least, are very supportive that Israel should have for the following uses. Either if you have grave suspicions against a serious criminal and you need to help gather evidence for certain things to prevent crimes or to prevent him from doing something. But even more importantly, this is a tool that's really developed for terrorism. Terrorists, as you can well imagine, operate in the darkest places, and it is very important that we have the ability to spy on our enemies, okay? Not on your citizens. And the crisis that has now come up is that it seems that in the police, in the Israeli police, and it's not clear who or what has done it, but it seems that in the Israeli police, they use this technology to spy on some very prominent citizens, including the director generals of a number of government ministries, including some mayors of towns in various places, and including some of the key witnesses in the Netanyahu trial. And in fact, this is something now that the defense, Netanyahu and his lawyers, of course, have appealed to the court to just figure out what is going on here, find out the extent to which the prosecution may have used some of this illegal material in order to build the case against Netanyahu. So this is an ongoing story. At this point, there's a lot more questions than there are answers. And there is quite a consensus in Israel, right and left and everyone in between, including the politicians, that this is a terrible thing and that must be investigated to its core. And we are expecting in the next day or so for there to be an announcement that an official state board of inquiry will be established to look into this. So if this is going to affect the Netanyahu trial, if this is going to affect other issues, we don't know, but I would just recommend that you all kind of stay tuned on that story. Another story that definitely was in the news prominently yesterday, but by today it will probably disappear, is a story that you may not even have heard of, and a story to me that I think is extremely significant, more significant than anything else. Okay? There is something called the Citizenship Law, and it's a law, like I'm sure in most countries, that determines who is eligible to obtain citizenship in any given country. And we have a law like that as well. Now, there is an amendment to that law that is passed, that has been passed for many years. It has to be renewed every year and has been done so every year for many years, which is aimed at addressing a particular issue. Unfortunately, we have an issue in Israel that there are Arabs who are citizens of Israel, particularly Bedouins in the south, but not only, who will take a bride from an Arab family in Judea and Samaria who are not citizens, and then will apply for citizenship by virtue of unifying the family. And through unifying the family, not only will that wife gain citizenship, but very often she will try to bring in her brothers, her sisters, her parents, or I don't know who. And this has become a creeping issue, or presents the danger of a creeping issue of changing the demographic balance, and of course enabling people who could very well be terrorists and all kinds of other people free entry in and out of Israel. For years, this is something that was for years, this is something that, again, as I mentioned, that was every year the government routinely renewed this amendment that would prevent that from happening. But because of our crazy government, first of all, a couple of things went on. The amendment itself is problematic, but one of the things they also want to do is have a new law that's far more comprehensive and that is connected with what is Israel? Israel is the state of the Jewish people. There's a lot of other things going on here. We want to make sure that that is protected by law. Anyway, what happened is this routine amendment was put up 6 months ago and was defeated for a very simple reason. The current government of Israel relies on an Arab party and relies on the far left Meretz party, both of whom are against this law. The Meretz party is a combination of Arabs and Jews. They are pro-Israel, but they have some very far out ideas of what Israel should be, and all too often vote with our enemies, okay? So they voted against this law because they said it was racist. They said, how can you discriminate against Palestinian wives as opposed to anybody else? Well, we know that Palestinian wives are in a different category because all too often they are essentially our enemies, not necessarily, but it's certainly something that needs to be checked. Anyway, because both the government, the coalition, and the opposition contain right-wing parties, okay? If you count the number of right-wing members of Knesset in the Knesset, without regard to whether they're in the opposition or in the coalition, you will find a solid majority. Also, all the center parties all very much support this law. However, last time, 6 months ago, Benjamin Netanyahu was the head of the opposition, gave the instruction that the opposition is going to vote against this law only because it was brought up by the coalition. And this was quite a crisis because the law fell, and then for the past 6 months, it was therefore much easier for Palestinians to come into Israel and to submit applications to become citizens, and there was not a whole lot that anyone can do because by law they had that right because this amendment was not renewed. Thank God we have a wonderful, wonderful Minister of the Interior. Her name is Ayelet Shaked. She's in Bennett's party. She's very right-wing. She has a real head on her shoulders. Not just that she's right-wing, but she's smart. And she understands how you do this. And therefore, what she did is she built a coalition in support of this law that included members of Knesset from the opposition and members of the question from the coalition, so that we had a broad consensus, which really represented Israeli society, everyone from the extreme right to the center, including the center. So you just had the extreme left that was off, opposing this, okay? All that looked good. It was going to be brought to the vote yesterday, and it was going to pass, except one of the parties in the opposition, again, we're talking about a crazy political situation where both the opposition and the coalition has a motley group of people. So in the opposition, in addition to the Likud and the religious Zionists and the ultra-Orthodox parties, all of whom are right wing, okay, we have Ahmed Tibi, who is not only an Arab party, he's anti-Israel, and he used to be the chief advisor to Yasser Arafat. That just tells you where he stands in this whole thing. But he's a member of Knesset, and he's a member of the opposition. And as is his constitutional right, he declared that the vote on this law would be considered a vote of confidence in the government. What that therefore means is that in the opposition, if they vote for the law, it is as if they're voting for the government. And as members of the opposition, they cannot do that. It just flies in the face of all the rules. So they were really stymied and they didn't know what to do. In the end, all the right-wing members of Knesset left the hall, left the hall of parliament of Knesset, walked out during this vote so that they would not vote against it. So you had maybe a handful of Arab parties in this Ahmed Tibi's party voted against it. You had in the coalition, they were voting for it. It was a government law, although Shaked and Bennett gave all the ministers and all the members of Knesset freedom to vote as per their conscience. And therefore, what happened is the Arab parties there either abstained or a few voted in for, but the result was an overwhelming majority for the law. Now, I look at something like this and I say, good morning. Good morning. What took you so long? We have an insane political situation. It is not normal. We all recognize it is not normal. And there are problems on all sides. I have in the past criticized Netanyahu strongly, not because of how he was as a prime minister, but because how he handled this political thing as a leader. But believe me, there are plenty of other politicians who are at fault here as well. And too often in the past 6 months, in fact, in the past 2 years, we have seen politicians that decide things much more based on their own narrow political interests, what will bring them more votes, what will give them the headlines in the newspaper or whatever, than what is in the nation's interest. And so I was so pleased to see that finally, we had one vote and one law passed that, and there was, by the way, a second law passed at the same time, a law that is considered a private member's bill that was put forward by a member of the right-wing parties in the opposition, okay, that curried major support, okay, because you had the opposition plus parts of the coalition voting for that law. And so now both laws are being tabled to a Knesset committee to put together the final legislation, and we hope that that indeed will pass too. So it's been a roller coaster, but I have to say that finally we saw the members of Knesset and the ministers realizing that they have to put the interests of the government before their own interests. I don't know how long this will last, but let's hope that this really does open the way for a whole different way. And what I will say is that was notably absent in this whole discussion was Netanyahu this time. Last time he was yelling and screaming and saying we're voting against, and he was the one who brought everybody to in the opposition to vote against the law. And this time he was absolutely silent. You don't hear him at all on this issue. So I don't know, maybe he's realizing that he caused some damage, and maybe he is starting to be a little smarter about how to use his enormous influence and to use it in the right way. So that is what we were dealing with. And that as I was thinking about that issue, I was trying to think, does this like remind me of anything? You know, very often I like to bring some kind of biblical teaching to reflects and enables us perhaps again a bit of perspective on some of the current issues of the day. And as I was thinking about this, I was reminded of a story that takes place in the book of First Kings. I don't know if you remember this story. It's not that well-known a story, I would think, but let me just summarize it for you. Where First Kings were deep in the split between the kingdom of Israel, the northern kingdom, and the kingdom of Judah. That, by the way, is what reminded me, because I was thinking, here we are, a nation that is split in a crazy way. Isn't there a way to cooperate? And I was trying to think, when was there an incident when the split between the northern kingdom and Judah, when they cooperated? And I remember this story that has some very interesting consequences. First of all, you have Ahab. Now, Ahab is well known as a king. He was an amazing king. He was a powerful king, but he was an evil king. Okay, the truth of the matter is that this is not the time to do a whole study of Ahab, but I studied the book of Kings with one of the foremost Bible scholars in Israel today. His name is Rabbi Samad, and he gave me some very interesting insights in this a few years ago that changed the way I looked at it. But I would say that if you look at Ahab as a whole, he didn't really get into the religious issues. The problem is he let Jezebel run the religious issues in the kingdom, and he was chasing after the prophets, and the worship of the Baal and all this stuff. But Ahab's main issue was power and kingdom and all that kind of stuff, sometimes for the good and sometimes for the bad. In this particular case, it's chapter 22. Jehoshaphat, who was then king of Judah, in a rare measure of unity, Jehoshaphat comes to Ahab. They're sitting together in Ahab's palace, and they're planning to go to war together. And they want to capture Havot Gilad, which is in the north, and they're going to war against, Ramot Gilad, which is in the north. It's interesting, by the way, that in my own community, Karnei Shomron, we have a small neighborhood on a hilltop called Ramat Gilad afterwards. It's named after this. That means the mountain of Gilad. It's actually named after Gilad, who was a young man who was murdered by terrorists some years ago. And that mountain was named for him, but it's very significant, I think, if I talk about this. Anyway, they were going to war against Aram to try to get back this area. And before they go to war, they ask, it is actually Jehoshaphat who says, let's hear what the prophets have to say. And they bring all these prophets, and they all say the same thing. They're praising Ahab, and they're saying, you're going to go out to war and you're going to win, and it's going to be wonderful, and nobody can defeat Ahab. And, they become like this chorus of cheerleaders for Ahab. And Jehoshaphat, I guess, gets a little suspicious about all this. And he says, all these guys saying the very same thing, it sounds a little suspicious to me. Isn't there somebody else that we haven't heard yet? So Ahab says, there really is. There is this one other guy who's a prophet, but I really don't like him because he's always saying bad things to me, But Jehoshaphat says, no, you really got to listen to what he says too. Okay, they bring this guy, his name is Michayahu, and he comes in, and true to form, he is the real prophet. Okay, those other guys, there's something also that is probably important to understand. In the ancient times, not just Israel had prophets, a lot of people had prophets. Were they real prophets? No, but they had that title. What were they? They were people in service of the king, and their job was to, let's say, read the fortunes of the king, give advice to the king. And because they got their salary from the king, they were very careful to only say the things that they figured the king wanted to hear. So in this case, in Ahab's case, these other prophets, they're not real prophets. They're state-sponsored prophets, okay? They're guys getting salary from the king, and so they're just telling him what he wants to hear. Go in your glory, you're going to win, it's great, okay? And along comes Michayahu, who's a real prophet, who has had word from God, and he says, you know what? They're sending, this was a trick, Ahab. They're trying to bring you down. God is trying to bring you down, but you should know, if you go out into war, you will have been trapped, and you're going to die, and the nation is going to be dispersed. Now, the question is, what does Ahab think about this? Does he believe it? Does he not believe it? Well, afterwards, he kind of goes, well, there's 400 here and 1 here. He goes to war. He goes with Jehoshaphat to war. But just before they go out to war, he says something very interesting. And this is in verse 30. He says to Josaphat, you know what? I'm going to dress up. He says, I'm going to dress up so they don't think that I'm a king. I'm going to dress up like an ordinary soldier. He says, you can stay in your clothes because you're the king of Judah. They don't have a thing against the king of Judah, but they know who the king of Israel is. So I'm going to dress up so they don't know who I am. Now, if you ask me, he's doing this because there's somewhere in the back of his head, they're saying maybe Michaiah was right. You know, Michaiah said, he didn't say what's going to happen to he didn't say there's going to be a terrible massacre against the nation. But he said the king of Israel, you, Ahab, are going to fall in this war. And so he says, you know what? I'm not going to take any chances. I'm going to dress up. And of course, what happens in a series of what looks like mistakes and coincidences and what else, they ended up killing Ahab. Not Josaphat, who's right next to him. They kill Ahab. And then as a result of this, you know, eventually at the end they continue fighting all day long. And at the end of the day, people find out the king is dead and just everybody disperses. So the exact prophecy that Michaiah spoke came true. But there's something here that I have always found so amazingly noble. Ahab, who, as I said, was primarily not such a good guy, but there were certain things about him that were very good. He cared deeply about the nation of Israel. He was pagan in some ways. I'm not exactly sure how much, because I think there was a part of him, you know, with like how he related to Elijah. And there was a part of him that still believed in God, but he let Jezebel run the religious affairs of the nation. And here too, he let those prophets run the affairs of the nation, but there was something in him that said he knew this was going to happen. But what does he say? He's shot already, he's killed, or not killed right away, but he's injured. At the beginning of the war, he says to his servants, prop me up. Make it look like I am still standing. Prop me up so that my people will continue fighting for the rest of the day. And they did. This is a man who cared deeply about his nation and cared deeply that they should not go down in shame before their enemies. This is a man who joined forces with Josaphat in order to stand against the enemies of Israel. And as I said, Ahab's a very complicated character. This is not a defense of Ahab in general, but it is something that tells us something about this one noble act that he did. And if I make a little bit of a connection to what we just talked about, you know, we saw, first of all, this importance of unity. The kingdoms of Israel and Judea were at war against each other, certainly hostile against each other for a long time. And he sought that unity. He wanted that unity with Josaphat. And so that was because he knew that was for the good of the people. Okay. He also, as I said, had the sense that, you know, I think he thought that there was a good chance Michaiah spoke the truth. In fact, he didn't kill him. He put him in prison. He says, well, we'll see what happens when we come back. He knew, he had a feeling that he was speaking the truth. Okay. And of course, one of the most important characters in this whole story is Michaiah himself. The courage to stand up, you know, all the kings in front of the kings and with all these other prophets singing the praises of the king, the courage to stand up as a lone person and say, but that is not what God wants. That is not God's word. I know God's word and I have the courage to speak it honestly. And I think, of course, that is a message that we can all learn. As each of you, especially as you're standing in your countries, very often amongst people who are against Israel or who mock, you know, your connection to Israel based upon God's word. Never lose courage. Remember Michaiah. He had the courage to stand up, even in front of kings, even with kings who could have killed him, who actually did imprison him because he said something they didn't like. Never allow that to dissuade you, because at the end of the day, God's word will win out. And those of us who stand true to God's word in the end, even though we have to go through certain obstacles, is certainly something that we can take inspiration from. And finally, as Joy has promised, I want to say a few words about one of our communities. Last week, I spent a whole day in the Hebron Hills and I visited 4 different communities, 3 of which are brand new communities to us. I mean, they've been around different stages of development, but they're brand new. For me, it was a treat to see these communities. I had never been in those three. And so I want to talk to you about one of them. Okay. One of them is the community of Avigil. Avigil is named for the biblical Abigail, in English, Abigail, one of David's wives. And it's named for her because of where it is located. When we first learned about the story of Abigail, now I had a bookmark here. What did I do with it? No. Okay. Oh, yes, I do. Here it is. In the book of 1 Samuel, this is during the time when David is running from Saul. Okay. And he comes and he encounters a very nasty fellow called Nabal. Nabal is called Nabal the Carmelite. And his wife is Abigail. Of course, it's Abigail who saves the day, who diffuses the tensions. And at the end, she becomes David's wife. Okay, but let's see how he's introduced to us in First Samuel chapter 25, verse 2. And there was a man in Maon whose activities took place in Carmel. So we have the names here of two different places, Maon and Carmel. Both of these places are south of Hebron. And today there are Jewish communities called Maon and Carmel, okay, in this area. Now, Avigil is on a hill not far from these communities, but just opposite the hill that Avigil is on is another hill. And that hill is called Tel Maon, which is thought to be the original site of biblical Maon. So basically, when this community, Avigil, was formed and named, it was named for Abigail, who came from the hill across the way. Okay, now the hill across the way is an archaeological site. They have found some very interesting things there. And that's not a place anybody's building on any time because, we want to preserve the archaeological findings there. But this is the closest community to that. And since there already was a community called Maon a little bit down the road, this was an appropriate name for it, Avigil. Now, Avigil is what you would call either an illegal outpost or a young community, as it's being called these days. Now, what do these communities mean? Now, there are, every so often, you have what they call these illegal outposts when you have a bunch of kids and they go up and they pitch a tent for a bit. And I don't call those communities. Those are more like protest stations, okay? But there are real communities that are fully supported by the regional council, by the other communities in the area, where families are living, albeit in some very difficult situations. And in these cases, we're talking about communities that have very important reasons for being established, that even people in the government agree that they should be established for various reasons. And yet, because of international pressure, they have refrained from giving the final permissions to turn these into total legal communities. And this was the story with Avigil. First of all, why is Avigil so important where it is? In the southern Hebron Hills, there are a few communities dispersed out. It's a largely empty area. And for many years, there wasn't a sense of urgency in settling that area because it wasn't like, oh, there was tons of Arabs there, and therefore, if we don't get in there, the Arabs will. But that has changed in recent years. Okay, so this is south of Hebron, but between Hebron and this area is another very large Arab town called Yatta, okay? So we have Hebron, we have Yatta. Here and there, we have some individual communities dispersed, but Avigil is right in the middle between Yatta and Arad. Okay, Arad is a town in the Negev that is across the Green Line. It's in what they call Israel proper. But what we were seeing is these Palestinians going out from their villages and just camping and talking about illegal outposts. They're the ones who have been setting up illegal outposts all over this area. And then, of course, they claim, oh, we've been here for generations, and they're damaging our ability to graze our sheep. And I'm telling you, there's been nobody in that area. Okay, there's just nobody. Here and there, maybe a shepherd walking by. There's nobody living there. And now you see this development, and the developing is being funded by the European Union through the Palestinian Authority. They have an absolute plan to settle not just areas near their community, but what is Area C? The areas that are in Israeli control and that are publicly owned, not privately owned. Avigil was this kind of a place, and it was actually founded by one man, Elisha Medan. Got a bunch of friends. His father, by the way, is one of the rabbinic leaders of a big yeshiva in the Gush Etzion area, a man that I studied from as well. He's a very, very big rabbi. Anyway, very, very supportive of settlement, etc. So his son went out there in a bus. He got himself an abandoned bus. He parked the bus up on the hill and asked his friends to come. 7 men settled there the eve of Yom Kippur in 2001, living in a bus. Why a bus? It has certain electricity. It has the ability to have lights. You know, they use the bus. Very interesting. Anyway, eventually other people joined them. They put up some mobile homes, some caravans. And then, as very often happens, there was a lawsuit. The Arabs sued the Supreme Court, claiming that they had stolen their land. The government came back and said, no, this is public land. And what was the result of this particular court was that the court ordered them to actually do the checking. They did the checking. They actually drew the official lines and came back with the conclusion, which the court accepted. This is not private Arab land. This is public land. So the Arabs lost that fight. That made it easier for them to bring more caravans, more families joined. And then there was another case against the Supreme Court where they claimed that they were living in places that, okay, this might be state land, but they're living in places where there's no permission to live. Now that's actually true because the government had never given them official permission to create a community there. The government was trying to, I mean, if I'm going to understand this, there's a lot of this I never understand, but if I'm going to justify it in some way, the government is trying to kind of, on the one hand, close a blind eye to the settlement because they think the settlement's important. And on the other hand, they want to be able to tell the president of the United States, who, me? I didn't approve this. What can I do? People just do what they want. Okay. And they kind of enjoy that in-between status. So this time the Arabs went back to the Supreme Court and they said, these may be state land, but these houses are being built and they don't have permission. The government then was forced to come before the Supreme Court and say, you're right, they don't have permission right now, but we have every intention of turning this community into a fully legal community. And then these homes will have permission, at which point the Supreme Court said, okay, what the people in Avigil and the Arabs both learned from these two court cases was the Arabs did more damage to their cause by bringing this lawsuit than it did damage to the Jews, because this forced the court and the government to make official statements, not only that this was state land, but that there was every intention of turning Avigil into official legal community. Now, and it is on the list. There is this famous list of what they call the young communities, other communities throughout Judea and Samaria that are in this similar in-between status. Families are living there, and in most of these communities, they're already not just living in mobile homes, in Avigil as well. They have built homes. Now, these homes do not have building permits, but they're not trying to force them to be destroyed either. What is the main problem when you build a house without a building permit, but you have the support of your regional council and no one is trying to tear down these houses? You still have a problem with electricity and water, okay? Because officially the government of Israel and the utilities are all under agencies that are government agencies. You cannot get utilities unless you have a legal building permit. If you don't have a legal building permit, you cannot get the electric company to connect you to power lines. And this has been a huge, huge issue. And so they have done all kinds of crazy arrangements. They hook up to some of the neighboring communities. They've done things, and of course, I'm no electrical engineer, so I don't really understand all of it, but they have put together some hookups, but it still limits the extent to which they have electric power. They have electric power. However, for example, there's not enough electricity to run heaters. certainly not to heaters that will heat your water. So they have now said to everybody in the community, please install gas-powered heaters for your water heaters. They're very popular in Israel anyway. It's very easy to get. It's a water heater that runs on gas instead of electricity. And that, of course, has solved some of the problem and has reduced the burden on the very, very weak electricity infrastructure. Okay, so you may listen to this whole thing and you could say, oh my gosh, this is insane. And I will be the first to agree with you. This is absolutely and totally insane. And I have to say that when I look at this whole situation, what they talk about, what they call the young communities, the pioneering communities, there is no excuse that the government of Israel has not approved them, that has not given official status so that people can build houses with building permits, get proper mortgages. Today, they're building without mortgages. The only way they can get funding to help them build is if their parents or their grandparents take out mortgages on their existing homes and then, give them the money, which of course is it ends up being at much higher rates. They're borrowing the money at much higher rates. So this is all quite frustrating and very difficult. But after all that has been said, we have today more than 50 families living in Avigil, putting up with this insanity, living it with so much difficulty, really, really difficulty. Of course, it is a beautiful place. You're up on this hill. You have like this 360-degree view. It's amazing. But they are putting up with tremendous, tremendous difficulties and expense. They are spending more money on their electricity. They're spending money on all kinds of other things that normally are just given to you as part of your municipality, utilities and whatever. And here they have to spend a lot more money for it. So it's I look at these places. I'm in a place like that. I am so I have such admiration for these people who are there. And you'll have to laugh, but when I was there, I said, okay, guys, so what do you need? And they said, well, we now, for the first time, have teenagers. Until now, most of their children were small, but they now have a growing group of teenagers and they need a clubhouse for them. I said, okay, so what are you going to do for a clubhouse and how can I help? They said, well, we have part of the problem solved. We have a bus. I said, you're going back to the bus? They said, yes. The bus is cheaper and it has in it the facilities for the lights and the electricity. I started to laugh. I said, are you telling me you're going to put a youth center in a bus? And they said, yes, we are. We just need some money to help furnish it and put it together. And I just thought this was amazing. Okay, you've got these people that are so creative and so determined. And if they have to put their kids in a bus for their activities, that's what they're going to do. And it is just amazing. And I have to say, look, of course, this is one of the reasons I was disappointed with Netanyahu, who promised several times that he was going to legalize all these communities. He published this list a few years ago and then did nothing. Bennett himself promised before he went into this crazy government that he was also going to legalize all these and criticize Netanyahu very much for this. And at this point, they haven't. I must say, though, that there are members of this current government that promising they are doing things to move this forward quietly. They, of course, have problems with their left-wing partners. It's an interesting situation, and we have to follow this. That's all I say. Let's see what happens, because we all have that expectation. I don't care who's in power. I have the expectation that these homes will be legalized. And just to add a little bit of a PS on that, and then, of course, I want to open it up to questions. A few weeks ago, you may have followed the news. They were talking about it. They actually passed a law which allowed illegal homes in the Negev, which are owned and built by the Bedouins, to hook up to electricity, even if they're not legal. Now, it wasn't 100% anyone that's not legal. It was those communities where the government has said it is in the process of legalizing them. In the Knesset, there was a move to include in this legislation these kind of communities in Judea and Samaria, the Avigils of Judea and Samaria, and that fell. But one of the reasons it fell was also a technical issue, because we have a different system of laws in Judea and Samaria, unfortunately, because sovereignty has never been applied. it is actually a military order. And it's very clear today, in order to organize, to make these communities official and legal, it only requires the signature of the chief of staff of the Israeli army. That's it. And that is something that just has to be done. Unfortunately, the Minister of Defense is kind of waffling on this issue. He's a Gantz, he's a center, sometimes to the left and sometimes to the right. I'm never quite sure where he is in all of this. He's certainly not right. He's not a solid right-wing guy, that's for sure. But anyway, we have to, this was brought up, but this is the irony that the Knesset passed a law to bypass these issues for the Bedouins. They have got to find out a way to bypass these issues for the Jews who are settling in Judea and Samaria and doing so much, contributing so much to the security and future of the state of Israel. And I would say not just the future, but we are contributing to the future by connecting to our past. I mean, Avigil is right on the road where Abraham walked as he was passing from Hebron to Beersheba. This is the area. This is the heart of biblical Israel. And if we deny our rights to this part of the land, what are we saying about our rights to the future of all of the land of Israel? So that is my message for today. And I'd love to hear from you. Unmute yourselves. I think you can unmute yourselves and ask away. Or Joy, if you want to say anything.
Well, can I say, Sondra, I might get into trouble for this from other Israelis, but everything you've just said about the character, and the commitment of those residents in Avigil. I was being interviewed by Barry Rogers for JAIR, the Jewish radio station that airs in Melbourne. And somehow the conversation became all about Judea and Samaria. And I came out with, to me, they're the real Israelis. And in another part, I said, they're gold, because
that's great.
Like we said, you run the gauntlet of terrorism and your own leftist government. And I heard recently that there can be 18 terror incidents a day in Judea, Samaria, Sondra. Is that right?
Well, yes, but let's put that in perspective. Many of them are attempted terror incidents. In other words, they're caught, before. Right. And others are like, someone threw stones, which I'm not belittling in any way. But that is not something that requires planning or a terrorist network. It can be just a 16-year-old who goes out to the road, picks up a rock and throws it. It's clearly a terrorist incident and it's clearly dangerous. But, what we are saying, though, is that, the Israeli army is really all over the place. They really are. But they're not catching it all. And let's remember that the Palestinian Authority is still giving money to families of terrorists. And it could be if a 6-year-old kid like that throws a stone, he's arrested. Well, his family's going to get money. Yep. So it's very possible that his mother says to them, you know what? Go out, throw a stone, and it'll bring us money from the Palestinian Authority. You'll spend a year in jail, then you'll be out, and we'll be living on the high ground. That could be what's happening too.
Yes. Yeah. So go ahead, anyone else. If we all coming together, I'll go to raise your hand if you know that little hand clip. That's Derek. Derek from the UK? Yes. Yeah,
there was an interesting video from the Israeli guys. They visited villages, Palestinian villages, and they actually videoed a fake terrorist attack. They had piles of tires, they had all sorts of things going on. They were throwing rocks also, but the international news was there filming it. But when you looked at it, the place was empty. There was no one else there.
Yeah, that's Joshua and Luke, Sondra.
Yes, I know them well, and I see their videos.
Another thing they mentioned, a lot of Palestinian towns and villages are empty. A lot of them are living in luxury in the States, and a lot of them have got a lot of money, But anyway, you can follow the
Well, I
Israeli
would
guys.
say there's some and some. I don't know if there's no Palestinian villages that are totally empty, but there are definitely places where, particularly, there are certain places in the Palestinian areas in Judea and Samaria where they have these beautiful homes that are empty. Okay, and their owners live abroad. And they keep those homes because they built them for a song. Meanwhile, they're off in the States and Canada and England, wherever, making a lot of money. And then they come to visit the family once a year for a few weeks, and you know, that's where they're living. So there's all kinds. I mean, but there is poverty in Judea and Samaria, no question.
Oh, yes.
But you know what? If the Palestinian Authority would just take all the money that it's paying to the terrorists and instead take a look at who needs the funds in their own community, the people who are poor, have job encouragement type of programming, you know, job training programming, have, you know, a friend of mine is a plumber and he does a lot of building and construction work and very often is working with Palestinian Arabs side by side on a project. And he told me this story. He said this one guy who lives in the next village over from where I live, and he said we're doing work in our community, and he says to my friend, "Look what you have here. You have nice schools, you have playgrounds, you have all, you know, beautiful gardens. So much has been invested by your government in your lives to make your lives better." Says, and I look at the Palestinian Authority, this is an Arab who's saying this, I look at the Palestinian Authority and I'm telling you, he hasn't so much as planting a tree or put up a swing in our village for the health and welfare and whatever of our people and our children. And more Arabs are saying this. They realizing it. It's corruption and it's misuse of public funds. It's terrible.
Yeah, wonderful.
Joshua was talking about Rawabi, you know, the new Arab city specifically, as being near empty.
That is, yes. So that was a city that it's a modern city that was created from scratch, that it was a big Palestinian Authority project. And basically what they were saying to the Europeans, we can build, we can look forward to the future, we can be modern. And they got all these Europeans to invest, and I think Gulf states as well, to invest in this construction, but like very few people live there. I don't know what the problem is. I don't know why. I don't know what the deal is there, but it's all very strange.
Yeah.
Anybody else?
Janine, I see, is raising her hand.
Yes.
Sondra, it's a question about Atarot Airport, the housing, because I read where they were going to turn that into a housing or estate, 9,000 units, and then it seemed like the US government seemed to be against it. But then I got an email today where it seems as though it's actually happening. Is that right?
Well, I think it's still being debated. The Atarot Airport is no longer an airport. There was once that airport, I remember years and years ago in the 70s, and I was here studying in Israel. My parents came to visit, and we took a plane from the Atarot Airport to Eilat. So many years ago, it was an airport, but at some point it became not financially feasible, and therefore it's just been sitting empty. It's an area north of Jerusalem, but very close to Ramallah. And it's an area that's part of the Jerusalem municipal boundaries, but again, the Palestinians, of course, say it's theirs, you know. And so it's an area that is important for Israel to build, and not just because it's a way to provide housing for a growing demand for housing in Jerusalem, but also to make sure that we're securing our boundaries there of Jerusalem. And so it's back and forth and back and forth. And another thing that's also up is the E1 area, where the government did make an announcement that there were, what Netanyahu never did, to give permission to build an E1, which is the area between Ma'ale Adumim, which is the big city in Judea, biggest city in Judea, to the east of Jerusalem. Between Ma'ale Adumim and Jerusalem, there's an area called E1, an area where the European community is trying to put all kinds of illegal structures because they want to put in a boundary that prevents the connection of Ma'ale Adumim and Jerusalem and enables potentially for a Palestinian state to create that boundary there, to be there in between. And E1 has been approved by every Israeli government. It has never happened. both of those issues are right now on the drawing table. And shall we say, let's keep watching that and see if it actually happens. Both of them should, and I hope they will.
Excellent. Thank you, Sondra.
Any other questions?
Just a comment. This is a thrilling update. Thank you, Sondra.
Thank you, Derek. Thank you for joining us.
Yes.
So really enjoying it.
Yes.
Excellent. Excellent.
I've got a comment just about Ramallah. When I went into Ramallah, there were apartment buildings, I think about 10 stories high, brand new. Nobody was living in them. And I guess they were funded by the EU and UN.
Yes, yes. First of all, Arab society doesn't like apartment buildings. We see that, for example, in Israel. And this is something we know from our personal relations with Arabs who are Israeli, who we meet and we talk to. It's very common when a young Arab man wants to get married, okay, the bride's father, and they still do a lot of arranged marriages, but the bride's father is not going to let her marry somebody who doesn't have a house, okay? So there's a lot of pressure on the young man to build a house before he gets married. Buying an apartment building doesn't quite cut it, okay? And so you'll very often see in Arab villages and towns in the Galilee, for example, you see a hodgepodge of building, because what will very often happen is the family owns a piece of land, they built a house, okay? 2-story house. And sometimes the son will build the 3rd story and that whole, story will be his. Sometimes he'll build a separate house, but on the father's land, and this makes it easier for him to say, I have a house. And so they have all these hodgepodge kind of solutions, but it certainly doesn't fit in with modern city planning and high-rise buildings. So that's also part of it. Are you going to, and of course, there are people who say we need to go more to high-rise buildings for the environment and for better use of land and all these other things. Who knows? But there's a lot of factors involved with that too. But there's no question, the European community is pouring money into the toilet. I think, Joy, I'll remind you, a few years ago when I was visiting with you and Marion, and I was reading a book, and I was laughing out loud, and you were saying to me, "What is so funny in that book?" Do you remember that?
Catch a Jew.
And it was this book that he pretended to be. This guy, he's Jewish and he's Israeli, but he's been living in the States for a while, and he's a journalist for a German newspaper. So he was going around Israel, interviewing all these Palestinians, telling them he's Toby, the German journalist. And they had no idea that he's both fluent in Arabic and fluent in Hebrew. Okay. Yeah. And so he was seeing so much of the lies behind what they were doing. And one of the things that he points out is how much money is being poured in to the Palestinian Authority for all these projects, that the Palestinians are doing a snow job on these German donors in particular, saying, we're doing this, we're going to have a large international conference. So this guy goes, and he goes to the conference, and with 3 people there, for which they got like €1 million. Okay. So it's a fabulous book, and I highly recommend it, especially if you want to laugh out loud. It's sad. It's sad, but it's really funny sometimes.
And he goes back to his Jerusalem cats after his day's work.
He's great. I met him actually. I met him in person. Right. He's hilarious. Yes. He really is.
Jihei has his hand up. I think we're hearing you now. Yep.
Oh, good. I think it's my earbud. I mean, I have no idea how that took place. So let me quick. I'm asking an old question, actually. Is the very first question that I asked Sandra when she came to Edinburgh to speak. And this has to do with this place, Gilead. And Prophet Obadiah clearly prophesied in verse 19 that Gilead will be occupied by the tribe of Benjamin. I just want to know how seriously should we take this prophecy?
Good question. Yeah.
Okay. Well, I think that
Wow.
Gilead is an area that was part of Israel before in the First Temple period. And I see exactly what you're talking about. It's in verse 19. And they will inherit the Negev, the Mount of Esau, the plains, the Philistines. They will inherit the field of Ephraim, the field of Samaria, and Benjamin will inherit the Gilead.
Yes.
Everything that is discussed here is something that is really just going back to the areas that we always were. Now, I have to say, most of these places, we're already in the Negev, we're in the Mount of Esau, we're in the plains, we're in the areas where the Philistines were, except for Gaza. Gaza was the Philistines, but also the area north of Gaza, like Ashkelon, Ashdod, Kiryat Gat. These were all Philistine cities that are now all part of Israel. We are in Samaria, we are in Ephraim. Now, the Gilead is the other side. Was the other side of the Jordan, the Gilead. So that we don't have, but we believe we will. Of course.
Well, I believe also because without these promises, we can't understand modern Israel properly.
Absolutely. We always have to keep our eye on the promises.
Good point.
Indeed.
Yeah.
Until the light and until the star is shining in the heart.
Right. Okay.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, GA.
Thank you, Sondra.
I like the way, Sondra, you've always said in 1967, you know, when you got Samaria in particular back, you were all able to say, oh, this is that. We are to settle the land, you know, and build houses. Yeah.
Well, you know that one of the reasons what has helped us identify, first of all, the Bible itself sometimes has geographical markers. You know, they'll say it's next to this lake or next to this valley or whatever.
Yes.
But one of the things that helps us identify where these places are, in addition to the archaeology, is Arabs who very often preserve the original name. Like when I talked about Tel Ma'on, the Arabs called that Me'in.
Okay.
So it was so easy to say Me'in. Oh, that's like Ma'on. You know, it's very similar. And we see that kind of thing happening all over Israel, where these names helped us remember, you know, where they were, what they were.
Yeah.
And
wonderful.
I'm sure we would all say this is why we love Israel and your people so much, because it's such wonderful evidence that God is real and what's written in his word is true. You know? Yes, I think.
And he's working.
Yes.
He's working. Amen.
It's really. But yeah, our heart goes out to you guys, Sondra, that you're doing all the hard work in many ways.
Yes.
As everybody would know, we can gift our finances to Sondra. And I hope everyone knows the website, www.cfoic.com. I keep going to put a .org in there, but you have lots of information and lots of reports on the communities too, don't you? Film clips. Yes. Did anyone want to have a final word? Because our hour is up. I'm so sure Sondra won't mind if we go over a bit, and I don't want to cut anyone short. Okay, that seems to be it, Sondra. So thank you very much again, and we'll look forward to next month.
Amen. Thank you so much.
I hope you enjoyed that video, and we'd like to be sure you're getting all of our video content. So just click on the subscribe button below, as well as on the notification bell, and that way you will have easy access to all our material. We look forward to staying in touch with you. God bless you, and have a wonderful day.